Alright, here's the purifier that we just finished assembling. We have our submersible pump on our incoming water. We're going to submerge it down in our one tank with the leads out that will go to our 12-volt battery. We're going to hang this purifier. You can hang the purifier on anything that is secure and steady. We're using a tree. You can use a stand. Notice that the angle of the purifier, the sodium hydroxide side is a little higher. We want the sodium hydroxide up against the membrane and the electrode. The chlorine side is down just a little bit. Our output hose will go back into our one tank. So in essence, what we're doing is we are circulating the water out of the tank, through the heat exchanger, through the venturi. Our output goes back down into our tank. We have our chlorine side with our cap on. We're going to remove our tank. We'll show you how to run the purifier. So the first thing that we are going to do is we're going to fill our chlorine side. I'm going to get a little bit of plain water. For this application, we'll be using granulated salt, and we will be using our measuring cup. We're going to fill it about 3/4 full of granulated salt. One thing that you do not want to do is to pour the granulated salt directly into the tube, especially if there's no water in it. If it solidifies, the salt could solidify and clog our drain hose and our air intake hose. So for granulated salt, you want to dissolve it. So we're going to put it in, dissolve it. Another reason you don't want to pour granulated salt in your chlorine side is the salt crystals could get in the grooves, and that could have an air leak. So we're going to dissolve our salt. You'll notice on our salt side that we have a sticker that says minimum and maximum. We want to fill our salt water to at least the minimum, between the minimum and maximum. Here. Now we are going to fill our just plain water in our sodium hydroxide side. Now this is what we call a cold start. We're starting just with plain water. Again, in the sodium hydroxide tube, we have a minimum and a maximum sticker. We want to bring the water level up to about the minimum. When you hang your purifier, you want to make sure that your purifier is not hanging directly over your barrel. If it's an open barrel like this, something might happen and the whole purifier might fall into the barrel. So we want to set the barrel off to the side. Now, we are ready to start the process. We have our salt water in this side. We have our plain water in this side. We want to make sure that we don't have any leaks, that all our fittings are tight. One of the things that we also want to make sure on the two valves here, we have brass gooseneck ball valves. We want to make sure that they are closed, because if we start our pump and they're open, we're going to have water shooting out. So we want to make sure that they're closed before we start. We're going to circulate the water through the venturi, making sure that we've got some bubbling action here before we ever connect our hub to the battery. Our leads to our submersible pump, we're going to connect red first. We're always going to connect red first, and then black. And you can hear the bubbling. You can hear the bubbling. Now to create the vacuum, we want to make sure that we have our cap on our salt side, not cross-threaded. This creates the vacuum. Remember the flow of the venturi that goes in the flow of the arrow. The water, as the pump pumps it out of the barrel through the venturi, the water squeezes down here, and that creates the vacuum because we have a closed system. Remember, this is our drain tube for our sodium hydroxide. This is our drain tube for our chlorine side, but it's also an air intake tube. If I put my finger over it, you can see the pull. As we make the salt water bubble, we're creating chlorine gas. Through the electrolysis process, the way this will work when we start to separate the sodium from the chlorine in the salt, using the hub, remember there's a special membrane in the middle, positive electrode and negative electrode. Now that we know we have no leaks, we know that our cap's on tight, we're seeing air bubbles here, air is being bubbled, sucked through our drain hose right here. We're going to connect our leads to the 12-volt battery, red first. Now through this electrolysis process, we should start seeing little bubbles. We see little bubbles, we'll see a lot of little bubbles, and then big bubbles. Little bubbles and big bubbles. Now since we see bubbles over here, we know that the sodium is being extracted out of the salt, leaving liquid chlorine on this side. Because we are sucking air up into our chlorine side, we know that we're making chlorine gas. So we're going to start testing our water. We're going to use our Chlorine Test Kit. And we're going to test what comes out of the end of the hose first. Okay, now that our process has started, we're going to start testing our chlorine levels. First, we're going to test what is coming through to make sure that we're making chlorine to start with. And we have two gooseneck ball valves on our Venturi. This valve tests the water that is in our drum or our barrel. This valve tests what's coming out of the Venturi that has a chlorine gas in it. So we're going to have Doug open this up. We're going to test to make sure that we're making chlorine. We use only the yellow side of the pool tester here. We only use one drop. So we're going to put one drop in. Put your finger over it and shake it. And you can see by the color, if you look at this side, you can see it's above 5 parts per million. On our pool tester we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we know we're making chlorine gas. We know that the Venturi, the gas is being sucked out of the tube into the Venturi. So as the water passes through the Venturi, the chlorine gas is injected into the water. 90% of our chlorination takes place in our tank. So now that we know we're making chlorinated water, we're going to wait just a minute and then we're going to start testing what's in our tank. We know that we've got chlorinated water. We can see the bubbles coming out here. So we're going to use this valve to test our chlorine level in our tanks. We need to bring the chlorine level up to, again, 5 parts per million in the barrel. So we've taken it out of this valve. We're going to add 1 drop. You can use either the front or the back side. I like to look at the back side. We're already at 1, going on 2 in our tank. It's not going to take this barrel very long to reach 5 parts per million. So within approximately 5 minutes, this particular quality of water, we should have 5 parts per million. We want to bring our chlorine level up to 5 parts per million. We have large quantities of chlorinated water going back into our tank. 90% of our chlorination takes place in the tank as the pump circulates the water.
So we don't have to chlorinate the whole tank. Not all the water is going to flow through here, just some of the water, because it gets high levels of concentration of chlorine, and that chlorine is going to disinfect the rest of the tank.
It is.
So the key is we want to bring in 5 parts per million or dark yellow from this valve. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
And what about this valve? Is this going to be 5 parts per million, or?
No, this valve actually, as the process goes on, remember each time the water comes through the Venturi, it picks up more and more chlorine gas. So when we test over here, now, we're going to be way off scale. We're going to be way above 5 parts per million because we've picked up more chlorine. It's almost orange. So let's test our barrel again and see what we're up to in our barrel. When we reach 5 parts per million, we're going to disconnect the hub first. Then we're going to disconnect our pump. and stop the process. But we're going to leave the purifier hanging here. First thing that we're going to do is disconnect the hub. Always red first. We're going to disconnect the hub. Now we're going to disconnect, red first, our pump. And we're finished with the process. Now is our wait time. Now we have to let the chlorine do its work. So we are going to let the barrel of water that we brought up to 5 parts per million chlorine, we're going to let it set for 1 hour. After 1 hour, we're going to retest the water. We're going to reach into the barrel. We're going to retest our water. And we should have 2 parts per million residual chlorine in our barrel. If we have 2 parts residual in our barrel, our container, our tank, then we know that after sitting 1 hour, we know that all of the cysts and all of the bacteria is dead. Now we've waited 1 hour. We've retested our water in our barrel, in our container, in our tank, and we have 2 parts residual. So it's time to put our purifier away for the day for this application. To do that, we're going to drain our sodium hydroxide and our chlorine out through our drain tubes, but there's some rules that you need to follow in doing this. The first one that we're going to drain is the chlorine side. Remember that because this is a closed system, this chlorine is very, very, very strong, and we don't want to spill it on ourselves, and it can be used in many ways. In another segment, you'll learn about different ways that you can use the liquid chlorine from the purifier as a byproduct. Because it's a closed system, we're going to first have an identified container to put our chlorine in that has labels on it. Do not drink, it's very strong. So when you use this chlorine, you need to know that it is very, very strong. We're going to loosen the cap so that we've got some flow. We're going to take the cap off of our container. And this should be a strong plastic container, not a water bottle or a milk container. We're going to carefully take our drain tube, hold it up high. We're going to put our tube, tip our container just a little bit, put the end of the tube in, and then hold it down so that it can drain. We're going to drain it out. Remember, if you get it on your clothes, you're going to have white spots on your clothes. We're going to put cap on. Now we're going to drain our sodium hydroxide side in the same manner. We have a different container. We have one that's marked sodium hydroxide, do not drink. The same thing. We're going to take our tube, hold it up high, put our tube in our container, and then bring it down low, draining the sodium hydroxide out. Now we can reuse this sodium hydroxide in our next application, and we'll cover that section a little bit later. Now, just because we've drained out the fluids doesn't mean that we're finished yet. We need to rinse each one of the tubes, the chlorine tube and the sodium hydroxide tube. So we're going to take our water, and this time we're going to fill the tube all the way to the top. This rinses off the membrane and the electrode. Now we're going to drain this. Remember, there's still a little bit of chlorine in this. So we're going to drain it down, rinsing out the chlorine side. Back in the holder. And we'll do exactly the same thing for our sodium hydroxide. Put the cap back on here. Rinse it real good. same here. This rinses both sides. And that's all there is to cleaning the purifier. We're going to take our submersible pump out, empty the water out. Clean it. Take our outlet. Now we can take it down off of our stand, off of our tree, the side of the tank, and put it away for security reasons.